All right, Nick, let's talk about the Oregon Ducks. Ducks, great offseason, great season last year for the Ducks. Didn't end exactly the way they wanted to, but nonetheless, you can't say this wasn't an impressive team last year. There's a lot to be happy for, and there's a lot to think that this Ducks team has a lot of good stuff going for it. But when we talk about the future of this team, there's a chance when you look at what the media is talking about and you look at some of the numbers, this is a team that could be even better than they were last year in one specific category. I think it's going to be interesting for the Ducks fans. So stay tuned for this one. But first, I'm Andrew. That's Nick, and this is Saturday Morning Inspection. All right, Nick, as I alluded to, one thing in particular, the Ducks are looking like they could be better in one category, and it's a really important one as well, and that's the defensive side of the ball. They could looking to be a really good team and actually potentially better than they were last year. Let's get into this article, and then we talked about the data more on the other side. So this is from Saturday Down South. Talked about Greg McElroy on ESPN came out, gave his top 10 defenses of the preseason, or early rankings of where he thinks the top defensive are. And so he says on an episode of his show this week, ESPN's Greg McElroy ranked the top 10 defenses in college football entering 2025. In fact, 6 of 7, the top 7 defenses ranked in the top 10 last season of EPA per play allowed. But going to the guys at the tail end of that, Oregon was ninth in that top 10 defenses. He said Georgia 55th in that category for EPA, Michigan 32nd, Oregon 38th, and Clemson 46th did not. Georgia had talent to bounce back. Michigan and Oregon both have big expectations in 2025, and Clemson got Penn State's defensive coordinator. So I think that key here is Oregon. There's a lot of expectations. There's a lot of reason for them to make a jump defensively, and they're already pretty good, 7th in college football last season. I think when you look at the data, you can start to see how. And let's compare Oregon to their biggest competition, the defending champions here, so to speak. Let's look at this graph we have here. This is Oregon versus Ohio State. Ohio State, good. They're number one defensively last year versus Oregon, like I said, top 7 defense last year. And you look, and the blue is the talent gained through recruiting through this 2025 class versus the red are players lost to the draft. And let's see the talent loss versus the talent gain. Now you look at blue, admittedly, really close. They have gained about the same amount of talent as far as the defensive side of the ball goes, in the mid 700s. I think talent gain for Oregon is like 750. Talent gain for Ohio State about 730. You look at what happens when it's talent lost. Oregon lost significantly less talent to the draft than Ohio State. That's the downfall of being a really good program is you're going to lose a lot of talent, but Oregon able to keep it up. Somehow they're able to mitigate the losses. They have a lot of depth, a lot of young players on this defense, so I think they're going to make the really big jump here around the 300 mark as the talent loss for Oregon versus almost 700. Actually, Ohio State lost a little bit more talent than they gained this year, and the talent loss versus gain is just a metric of grades in your 24/7 high school recruiting profile, what grade it is, the sum of all those grades for the players gain and loss. So you look at Oregon, I think that's the key here. Is this is a team people are saying, hey, there's a pronounced jump that could happen on defense for Oregon this year. We're seeing them as a team who's going to be really good. Why is that? Well, they were good last year, and when you look at what they lost versus what they gained about 400 more points of talent, let's call it, and talent indicator, 400 more points of talent this year than they lost. Other teams, Ohio State, they actually lost a little bit more than they were able to gain. They're going to be technically, by looking at the chart, looking at the numbers, a tiny bit worse than they were last year defensively. Now, that doesn't always work in practice, but if you look at the numbers, this seems like a very interesting year for Oregon defensively. I think there's a lot going on, and I think seeing this chart, we should expect a big jump defensively for the Ducks. Curious what your thoughts are on this one, Nick. But before we get to you, Ducks fans, in the comment section below, we're talking about defensive talent added, defensive talent lost. I think there's a lot of good stuff going on here. So let us know in the comment section below twofold. One, who is your favorite defensive player the Ducks added this year through this 2025 recruiting cycle? Give us one guy there versus two, which player that left the Ducks to go to the NFL defensively was your favorite player? So twofold. Who'd you like? Who's your favorite addition through the 2025 class? And who is your favorite subtraction that left to go to the NFL? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section below. But nonetheless, Nick, what are your thoughts on everything here for the Ducks?
Yeah, I think defense is one of those things that's very interesting because their numbers weren't bad, like you brought it up last year for Oregon. But the reality in the big moments in the big games, they weren't where they needed to be. If you go back to the three games that come to mind, the two Ohio State matchups and the Penn State matchup, you can go to the Ohio State victory. They still surrendered 31 points. And people forget, of course, that the Ohio State was driving. There was that final seconds where they couldn't get that, the final timeout in before clock expired. That could have been a 2-point loss or a potential game-winning field goal there right around the corner. 31 points they surrendered that game. Not a disastrous performance, but certainly not good. Surrendered 37 against Penn State. And of course, that debacle in the Rose Bowl, they ended up surrendering 41 total that game to Ohio State. You could argue it could have maybe even ended up worse if Ohio State had really kept pressing the issue. I think this is going to be a good offensive team, but the reality is the big game component of this defense is significantly lacking. And I think this talent upgrade, or at least compared to the talent that lost, the overall baseline improving, is going to be critical for Oregon because this is how you take this next step. We saw this a lot of times in really the SEC. They'd have a guy that have a really good season. This was before Georgia was winning those national titles, before they won back-to-back. They have a good season. They have a great defense, great team. Then they run into like Alabama or that kind of equivalent in the SEC championship game, and then they get rolled, right? You lose 40-20 or something like that. Like, okay, we're not there yet. We're good. We can beat up on the bad teams, right? But how do we become a great team and hold our own against the great teams? There's that adage, right? What do good teams do? Good teams beat up on the bad teams. What makes a great team? A great team doesn't have a significant drop off in terms of how they play versus the bad teams and the other good teams. And I think that's what Oregon needs to do defensively, specifically here, to elevate themselves to be a national championship team, to actually execute and win that national title. They need to have a baseline performance on defense where there is no drop off for when they play against Purdue versus when they play against Ohio State, right? Now, obviously, it's going to be harder, right? You may give up 3 points to Purdue, you may give up 20 points to Ohio State, but from an overall perspective, it isn't just a massive delta. Because if you look at Oregon's numbers defensively, it was dominant at times. Like, for example, they surrendered 13 points to UCLA, 10 points to Michigan State, 31 to Ohio State, and then 0 to Purdue, and then 9 to Illinois. So if you literally add all those numbers up, they surrendered 32 points total over 4 games of conference opponents, and then 31 to Ohio State. That's too big of a delta, right? Against the good teams, you're going to give up some points. It's going to happen, but you can't have that massive disparity. You got to be more consistent, right? And more importantly, you got to bring that 31-point number down. You look at, of course, that Penn State game. 37 points surrendering. Penn State, good offense, talented squad. I get it, but you need to do better defensively. And we saw that come to its head in the Rose Bowl. Consistency in those big games in terms of defensive performance is absolutely critical. It's what makes championship teams. We all focus on the quarterback position, and rightly so, right? You need to have that clutch gene, the ability to win games and take over those big moments. But it felt like it was going out of there for a little bit. College football was becoming grass basketball, but it's still as true now as it's ever been. It's a cliche. We hear it every single time. We've heard it from our grandpas going back 150 years, it feels like, but it is still true. Defense wins championships. You need to have a defense that can perform in those big moments. Oregon, or specifically last season, their defense did not perform up to that level. I'm optimistic, and Ducks fans, you should be too, that this overall improvement, baseline level of talent, and certainly compared against their competition, will allow them to perform much better in those big moments.
Yeah, Nick, and I think when you look at the Ducks and what they're able to do this offseason as far as how they attack recruits, how they went about what they were doing in that aspect, and over the last 2 years too, because it's not just going to be talent gain just this year versus last year. I know we're looking at the graph and it's who they lost this year versus who they gained, but it goes over the last couple of years, and I think we've seen the last few years what Oregon has done as far as going to recruit players. They've brought in a ton of talent on defense that I think we're going to start to see cycle in. I think that's where McElroy is coming from, ranking them so highly. You look at this 2023 football recruiting class, out of 29 players here, 16 of them defensive players, 10 defensive linemen in that 2023 class. An insane amount of defensive linemen for Oregon. They should have all of the guys coming in, but going 2024 as well. Again, another class, really good, 26 enrollees. Out of that 26, 14 of them defensive players. Again, a team that I feel like there's been a concerted effort the last few years to not just focus on offense, not just be that grass basketball team, as you said. Then finally, this last season for the Ducks, out of 16 guys, another 8 guys on the defensive side of the ball. So quality over quantity here for the Ducks. And I think that's important. I'm talking 14, 16 guys. The talent game score on those would be a lot, but that's a lot of players in that category. You look at what the Ducks did this year, only 8 guys on the defensive side of the ball, but still a comparable amount to Ohio State and what they were able to gain and talent-wise on that defensive side of the ball. I think that's really big for Oregon. A lot of players here, a lot of guys doing early. Safety Trey McNutt is a guy we've heard a lot about early on. I think this team is looking really good. It's like you said, I think there's something special. I think defensive side of the ball, there's been more of a focus. Even the transfer portal, we're not talking about the transfer portal right now, but there's been big additions there. Bear Alexander from USC coming over to Oregon, supposed to be a big-time player already. We did a story about him a couple months ago, talking about how he's doing good. I just think defensive side of the ball, something to watch for Oregon. They've been good at times, like you said, but there's also been some big letdowns. You can't have the Ohio States repeat themselves. You can't have the Penn States repeat themselves. And how do you do that? You focus on the defensive side of the ball. Part of it is a waiting game. You got to let guys mature. Like we said, 2023, a lot of defensive players in that class, 2024 as well. Let them mature, let them grow, but also you got to keep bringing in talent. And we saw that this year. Plus, Oregon didn't lose a ton of players as well. I think it's a really good thing going on for the Ducks on the defensive side of the ball.
Yeah, and just one final point to end on, right? When you talk about what matters in these big games, or at least what has mattered to a lot of championship teams in the past, it's depth, right? Exactly what you mentioned there. Young guys stepping up, growing and developing with just a incredible quantity mixed with that great quality that you mentioned as well. Defensive players coming in multiple classes. Oregon will have an army of defensive pieces, a huge amount of depth. That was the underrated secret of the Nick Saban Alabama dynasty, is that defensively, specifically, they had crazy levels of depth, right? The running joke was that if the 2 starters and the 3rd stringers were in, it was 3 5-star. It was a 5-star recruit. It was a 5-star recruit. It was a 5-star recruit on the defensive line, right? You couldn't get away from them. They just had so much talent at so many different levels of the depth chart. Oregon is slowly but surely building up to that level, and that's what it takes to win champions. We all love what Bo Nix did. We all love what Dillon Gabriel did. We're excited for the future of this offense. But it's still true. I'm going to say it one more time. Defense still wins championships, right? It's certainly defensive depth, certainly clutch defensive performance, and Oregon has done a great job addressing that issue over the past couple off seasons, and we should see it come to a positive head this upcoming year.